the mapmaker of Solitude. In the quiet, forgotten town of Solitude, nestled deep in a high mountain valley, the world was defined by boundaries. There was the sharp, unforgiving boundary of the granite cliffs that encircled the town, cutting it off from the easy commerce of the plains. There was the seasonal boundary of the snows, which for 5 months of the year sealed the only passable road and left the town to its own devices. And then there were the quiet, invisible boundaries drawn by Eleanor Vance. At 67, Eleanor was the town's cartographer, a profession so unique and unnecessary in a place that never changed that the townsfolk simply referred to her as the map lady. From the front room of her small, meticulously kept cottage, she spent her days surrounded by the tools of a lost art, fine-nibbed penspots of India ink brass protractors, and heavy sheets of vellum that smelled of time and paper. She was a woman of lines and measurements of precision and quiet observation. Her hair, a soft, snowy white, was always pinned in a neat twist, and her eyes, the pale grey of a winter sky, missed nothing. Her presence in Solitude was a quiet mystery. She had arrived 15 years earlier, a solitary woman, with a few heavy trunks that were rumoured to contain nothing but books and maps. She purchased the old surveyor's cottage and largely kept to herself. She did not seek friendship, but she was not unkind. She would chart a farmer's new pasture for a fair price, or draft a legal boundary map for a mining claim with an artist's precision. Her work was flawless, her silence absolute. This silence was a fortress she had built around a past life in Boston, a life of prestige promise and profound betrayal. She was the daughter of the great cartographer Eleanor Vance and had been his gifted apprentice. Together, they had been working on his magnum opus, a grand definitive map of the Western Territories. But after her father's sudden death, his most trusted protégé, a brilliant and ambitious young man named Caleb Blackwood, had vanished. He had taken not only her father's years of research and unpublished charts, but also Eleanor had believed her heart. Caleb had published the great map under his own name to immense acclaim, while she left with nothing but the raw field journals, and the ghost of her father's legacy had retreated from a world that had stolen everything from her. Solitude was not just a place, it was her life's principle. Her carefully drawn world was disrupted by the arrival of Sarah Gable and her 10-year-old son Leo. They came to take over the town's failing general store left to Sarah by a distant uncle. Sarah was a young widow with a resilience that shone in her warm hazel eyes, but it was a resilience being worn thin by worry. The store was poorly stocked, the debts were high, and the town's economy was slowly starving. Leo was a quiet, observant boy with an uncanny talent for drawing. He would sit for hours with a piece of charcoal sketching the mountains and the town, with a startling accuracy that caught Eleanor's trained eye. Eleanor found herself drawn to them against her will. She saw in Sarah a reflection of her own younger self, a woman trying to make her way in a world not designed for her. She saw in Leo a flicker of her father's gift. She began to leave small things on the store's porch, a basket of vegetables from her garden, a freshly baked loaf of bread. One day she left a small set of proper drawing pencils and a pad of fine paper for Leo. Their unspoken friendship was just beginning to blossom when the architect of Eleanor's painful past arrived in Solitude. Caleb Blackwood did not look like a villain. He was in his late 40s, distinguished and handsome, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that seemed to repel the town's dust. He was now the chief surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad, and he had come with a promise that felt like salvation to the desperate town. He was there to find a route for a new spur line through the mountains, a route that would connect Solitude to the world and bring prosperity with it. He held a meeting in the town hall, his voice smooth and confident as he unrolled a large preliminary map. He spoke of jobs of commerce, of a future where supplies and medicine were not a week-long journey away. The town was captivated, hanging on his every word, all except Eleanor, who had recognized him the moment he stepped from his carriage. The sight of him was like a physical blow, a ghost walking into her sanctuary. She had slipped out of the meeting, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Caleb, in his ambition, did not recognize the quiet, white-haired woman in the back of the room. But he soon learned of her. His preliminary route, the most obvious path through the valley, was proving difficult. The initial survey teams reported unstable rock formations and treacherous winter passages. He needed local, detailed knowledge, and everyone he asked, from the oldest miner to the town's doctor, said the same thing. You need to talk to Eleanor Vance. She knows these mountains better than anyone. The confrontation when it came was quiet and devastating. He appeared at her cottage door one afternoon, his polished boots a jarring intrusion on her simple stone path. Mrs. Vance, he began, his professional smile firmly in place. I am Caleb Blackwood with the Union Pacific. I'm told you are a cartographer of some skill. Eleanor simply looked at him, her pale grey eyes holding his. The silence stretched. The flicker of recognition dawned in his eyes, slowly replaced by a look of utter profound shock. Eleanor, he whispered, his composure finally cracking. My God, I thought you were still in Boston. You hoped I was, she replied, her voice level devoid of the emotion that was raging inside her. The past flooded the space between them. He tried to explain, to excuse his actions of 15 years ago. He spoke of ambition, of the pressure to succeed, of his belief that he was honoring her father's work by bringing it to the world. They were the hollow, self-serving words of a man who had justified his theft long ago. You stole my father's life's work, Caleb, she said, cutting through his excuses. You stole my life's work. There is nothing more to say. But there was. He needed her. The route through the pass is more complex than our initial surveys suggested. He admitted, his pride warring with his necessity. I've seen some of your local charts. Your detail work is extraordinary. The railroad is prepared to pay you handsomely for your expertise, Eleanor, to help us find the safest, most efficient path. The irony was staggering. The man who had stolen her masterpiece now needed her skill to complete his own. She saw her chance for a quiet final victory. No, she said simply, and closed the door. Caleb, however, was not a man who accepted refusal. He began a quiet, insidious campaign. He knew the town was desperate, and he used that desperation as a weapon against her. He went to Sarah Gable. He offered to extend a generous line of credit to the general store, enough to fully stock the shelves and save her from bankruptcy, contingent on her convincing her friend Mrs. Vance to be reasonable. Sarah was torn. She came to Eleanor, her face etched with shame and worry. He says he can save the store, Eleanor. He can save this town. Leo, he needs a future here. Eleanor felt the trap closing. Caleb was forcing her to choose between her own principles and the well-being of the only people she had allowed herself to care about. At the same time, she began to study her father's old field journals, the only things Caleb hadn't taken. They were filled with dense, cryptic notes, sketches, and strange annotations about the very paths the railroad wanted to use. Her father had surveyed this area extensively years ago. His notes spoke of a hollow heart, of a sleeping giant, of a path of whispers. It was not the language of a surveyor, but of a man who listened to the land. She sought out the town's elderly physician, Dr. Aris Thorne. He was a gruff but kind man who had known her father briefly long ago. Eleanor Vance was a genius, Dr. Thorne told her, sipping tea in her quiet parlour. But he was eccentric. He believed a map wasn't just about lines on paper. He said it was about understanding the mountain's story. He spent a whole season up in that pass, came back looking haunted, said the direct route was a fool's path, a shortcut to disaster. Eleanor spent her days in the mountains, with Leo often trailing her, his sketchbook in hand. She followed her father's old trails, comparing his notes to the terrain. She was a detective piecing together a geological mystery. She realized his strange notes were not poetry, but warnings. A hollow heart referred to the vast network of limestone caves he had discovered beneath the valley floor, making it structurally unsound for the weight of a train. A sleeping giant was a massive, unstable rock face prone to avalanches. The path of whispers was a reference to the strange acoustics of the wind through a narrow, hidden canyon. A safer, more solid route, but one that was longer and would require more engineering. Caleb Blackwood, with his modern, arrogant approach, saw only the shortest distance between 2 points. Her father had seen the soul of the mountain. The final confrontation came as the first heavy snow of winter began to fall, threatening to close the pass for the season. Caleb called a town meeting to announce he was moving forward with his chosen route, with or without Eleanor's approval. He promised jobs, starting immediately, painting a picture of a prosperous winter. The town was on the verge of accepting their desperation, outweighing their nascent loyalty to Eleanor. Just as he was about to call for a vote, Eleanor walked in her arms, full of her father's journals and her own newly drawn, meticulously detailed maps. She was followed by Dr. Thorne and Sarah, who carried a large geological cross-section Leo had helped her draw, illustrating the hollow heart of the valley. It was not a showdown of guns, but of knowledge. Mr. Blackwood's route is indeed the shortest, Eleanor began, her voice clear and steady, filling the silent hall. It is also a death trap. She unrolled her maps, laying them beside Caleb's. Using her father's journals, her own survey data, and Dr. Thorne's testimony about the valley's history of rockfalls, she explained the science. She spoke not just of angles and elevations, but of responsibility. She told them about her father, about his belief that a mapmaker's first duty is to safety, to truth. She was not just defending a route, she was defending her father's legacy. Then she presented her own proposed route, the path of whispers. It was more difficult, more expensive, but it was built on a foundation of solid granite. It was safe. Caleb tried to dismiss her, calling her findings the sentimental ramblings of a bitter old woman. But the townspeople looked at the evidence. They looked at Eleanor's painstaking work, at the earnest face of Dr. Thorne, at Sarah Gable, standing firmly by her friend. And then they looked at Caleb, and they saw not a saviour, but a gambler, willing to risk their lives for his own profit. The storekeeper, Mr. Gable's father-in-law, was the first to speak. "I'll side with the woman who knows the mountain over the man who only knows the money." A murmur of assent went through the crowd. The town had made its choice. Defeated by the truth he had tried to ignore, and by the quiet integrity of the woman he had wronged, Caleb Blackwood left Solitude the next day. His promises turned to dust. The railroad did eventually come to Solitude, but it came the following year along the safe, steady route Eleanor had mapped. It brought the prosperity it had promised, but on the town's own terms. Eleanor Vance did not retreat back into her fortress of silence. Her cottage became a centre of learning. She took on Leo as her formal apprentice, his talent for drawing blossoming under her guidance. She worked with the railroad, her maps becoming the standard for safety and precision throughout the territory, her father's name finally receiving its proper due alongside her own. One bright summer afternoon, she sat on her porch with Sarah, watching Leo in the distance, carefully sketching the path of the newly laid tracks. The train whistle echoed through the valley, no longer a threat, but a sound of connection, a promise kept. Eleanor looked down at her hands, no longer just the tools of a solitary artist, but the hands that had redrawn the boundaries of her own life, and in doing so had mapped a new future for a town that was no longer named for its solitude, but for its strength,